Gentlemen, namaskar, and welcome to the 16th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India in the Darbar Hall. We are delighted to introduce Courting India, England, Mughal India, and the Origins of Empire, with Professor Nandini Das in conversation with William Dalrymple. When Thomas Roe arrived in India in 1616 as James I's first ambassador to the Mughal Empire, the English barely had a foothold in the subcontinent. Roe was representing a kingdom that was beset by financial woes and deeply conflicted about its identity as a unified Great Britain under the Stuart monarchy. Meanwhile, the court he entered in India was wealthy and cultured, and its dominion was widely considered to be one of the greatest and richest empires in the world. Nandini Das's fascinating history of Roe's 4 years in India offers an insider's view of Britain in the making. We are delighted to introduce our first guest, Nandini Das, who is a professor of early modern English literature and culture and a fellow of Exeter College at Oxford University. She is a scholar of Renaissance culture, travel, migration, and cross-cultural encounters. Courting India, her book on the first English embassy to Mughal India, is forthcoming from Bloomsbury in March 2023. Joining her is William Dalrymple, the author of many prize-winning books, including White Mughals, The Last Mughal, Return of a King, and of course, Anarchy. Dalrymple has been awarded 5 honorary doctorates and is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, the Royal Asiatic Society, and the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and has held visiting lectureships at Princeton, Brown, and Oxford. He is also, most importantly, a founder and co-director of the Jaipur Literature Festival. We're looking forward to a fantastic session. Thank you.
We have the mics, guys. Brilliant. Well, welcome. Any of you who attended the opening session yesterday, where Nandini was in conversation with Catherine Rundle, will know what a formidable brain and speaker we have on the podium today. Nandini is someone we've had virtually before at Jaipur, when speaking last year on the Krista Purana and Thomas Stevens, one of the early Jesuits coming to Goa, Brits flying in to Goa for sun and pleasure, even in the 16th century. But we have now the great privilege of presenting her first public event about her new book. We share an editor until last year, before he'd retired. And I have been given updates on this project ever since the proposal turned up, for which he was sort of ecstatically excited. He's quite a lugubrious chap and is not naturally electrified easily. And when Michael told me about this project 3 years ago, I think, he said this is going to be a massive and extraordinary book. And I've just been reading the final page proofs today in bed this morning, bleary-eyed, and it is garlanded with the grandest series of quotes by the greatest authorities that you've ever seen. So it's going to be a very, very important book, and it's published in 2 months' time, and this is the preview. Nandini, just to open, could you give a sketch of, often when people talk about the colonial British or the colonial experience, everyone immediately assumes that we're talking, all-powerful Britain and crushed India. But your book paints a completely opposite position, that the Mughal Empire is the richest country in the world, astonishingly wealthy, astonishingly sophisticated, and Britain is this sort of pathetic, religiously repressive, impoverished, cold island somewhere lying off the coast of Europe. Tell us the picture you present.
Thank you, and thank you so much, all of you, for being here. I'm half blinded by the light, so I can't see any of you, but thank you nevertheless. Yes, I mean, the picture we have of the relationship between, or the relative power balance between England and India in this period is completely different. There's a moment much, much earlier in Virgil's Aeneid, the Roman epic, where Virgil describes the ancient Britons, and he says the Britons completely divided from the rest of the world. This little island hanging on in their fog and murky rain, essentially. And the moment we are talking about, this is post-1570, and that sounds like an arbitrary date, doesn't it? But it actually isn't. So that's the moment where the Pope, the Catholic Pope in continental Europe, declares that Elizabeth I is an enemy to the true Christian faith. Okay, so it's
this is a lot worse than Brexit.
This is the Pope's fatwa, essentially, on Elizabeth I.
Brexit plus Salman Rushdie.
I know, isn't it just? And what do the British do? So the main thing is that, the English at that point, the main thing is the worry of the merchants. The main kind of revenue for the English at this point is English wool. How can they trade? How can they earn that money unless they can send it to continental Europe? So
this isn't a contemporary story at all.
No, I mean, I can't see any resonance, can you? But they do exactly what you would expect them to do, which is they say, well, we'll try to get a trade deal with the global south instead. And that's the start of the story, why all these English adventurers, right from the 1580s onwards, there's a dribble of people coming towards India, hoping for trade.
And as we will see, rather like Theresa May chasing Modi, and Modi being very uninterested in her proposal, we see resonances in Roe, but we'll hold our horses before we get there. And just give it a picture, because you painted such a... I mean, I was brought up on this. I'm a Catholic in a Protestant country, and I grew up on tales of Catholic recusants and Catholic Jesuits being hung, drawn, and quartered. But people here may not know that sort of... What did it mean by this point to be a Catholic in Britain? How religiously repressive was it?
I think the key thing here would be what this point means. I mean, Elizabeth's period is rough enough for English Catholics because any kind of religious Catholic action is seen as treason to some extent. So if you go to Mass, if you hold a Mass, if you accept a Catholic priest into your household, that means you a person who is liable to be treacherous in some way or the other.
And if the local sheriff turns up, or whoever the law forces are, or the
you wouldn't want that at all.
And you find a Jesuit sitting in the priest hole in your house, what happens to you, and what happens to the Jesuit?
Well, the Jesuit would probably be taken away to the tower and interrogated, and there was good reason for that, because there was a concerted effort to send Jesuit priests into England. There was always a hope within Catholic Europe that England would see light at some point and come back from this terrible idea.
Just like Brexit, yeah.
Well, but England never did. This is the point. When James I comes to the throne, the situation gets somewhat more problematic. Elizabeth I realizes that actually the English Catholics are useful contacts in some ways. She famously says, "I shall not make windows into men's souls." So whatever you do, so long as you're doing it undercover and away from the public eye, it's fine, I don't want to know. James is brought up in a very, very strict Protestant household.
And yet his mother is a Catholic.
Precisely, which causes no end of trouble for him.
Mary Queen of Scots.
Mary Queen of Scots is Elizabeth I's greatest rival, famously beheaded at the end of a whole degree of soul-searching by the Queen, because it's dangerous to behead another queen, sets up a bad example. James comes to the throne. He's deeply Protestant. England itself is deeply
and kind
Protestant.
of nuts about witchcraft, right? Sort of crazy shit about witchcraft.
Royals are known to sometimes write strange books, and James is one of them. He writes demonology.
I saw on Twitter last week when Harry's book came out that someone had said this is the craziest book ever written by a royal. They said, no, you clearly haven't read James I's book on witchcraft.
It's full of handy tips on how to recognize a witch if you see one.
Give us some examples, because if you never know at JLF, there's all sorts of people.
Well, James had good reason. He believed that when he had married Anna of Denmark and brought her over, there was a great storm at sea, and he believed that it was caused by witches.
I grew up in North Berwick, where the witches were from, I should say. And our kind of pre-breakfast leg stretch, to use a Coriat, was to climb up North Berwick Law, which is a big hill, on top of which the witches are meant to have assembled and had their coven, bringing up this great gale. But of course, anyone that's born in this corner of Scotland knows there are gales all winter, every winter.
You don't need to go into much effort to bring up a great gale.
And this is also, we should say, as we're in a literary festival, the same event which inspires Macbeth's witches.
That's right, yeah. That whole idea of stirring up toil and trouble.
So kind of crazy nut stuff in the British court. Give us a picture of the religious freedoms or unfreedoms at the same time in Jahangir's court in Mughal India, a lot of which is spending time nearby in Ajmer at this point, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah. Jahangir kind of emulates the kind of framework that had set up by Akbar to a great extent. So there's a degree of religious debate. He has Hindu and Muslim artists in his kind of workshops.
Atelier. Yeah.
They're creating miniatures, they're translating. There's a huge amount of
pictures of sadhus when he's exiled to Allahabad.
That's right. I mean, that's part of something that I write about. There are really interesting echoes. Roe, for instance, there's a wonderful bit in Thomas Roe's journal where he talks about Jahangir meeting a Hindu hermit. And he says that he comes in to see the Mughal emperor and sees this weird man sitting next to him in rags. And Jahangir continues to ignore the English ambassador and talk to this man. So, Roe is not a little bit miffed by that.
Which is also,
there.
Of course, the famous miniature where we have not talking to a Hindu holy man, but the miniature where he's talking to a Sufi.
That's right.
And ignoring James I, who's at the bottom of the pile, underneath, and with only the artist himself lower. Yeah.
Yes, with an astonishing queue of people waiting for audience. They all have terribly bored faces, the kind of faces you see in queues at buses, waiting for Jahangir's attention.
But just to clarify this, because this is a matter of huge national debate here in the country, there are the old Nehruvian idea that the Mughals were very tolerant are being questioned multiply on every platform here. What's your view as a scholar on how free or unfree Hindus would have been at this time? Because we just talked about Catholics being very unfree in England.
Yeah.
If you had to compare the two,
well, I think the interesting thing is Roe's perception of the way Indian Mughal frameworks, governance works. And what he notices, what he reports, is that where it counts is that the Hindus, the non-Muslims, are free to do business. And for Roe, that's a really important thing.
Would Catholics not be free to do business in Britain?
Not if they were explicitly of Catholic faith. The same applies to strangers. So the technical term for foreigners settling in Britain at that point are strangers or aliens. And the thing about strangers or aliens was that your independence in terms of doing business, earning money, and kind of growing wealth was severely curtailed. So you couldn't leave your inheritance to your children. Why would you earn wealth in that case, for instance? What Roe observes in India comes through repeatedly in his journal, and it leaves such a deep mark on him that he keeps coming back to it throughout his long kind of diplomatic career. The sense that the Mughals had figured out the way to create stability within the country was to allow the other faiths a degree of freedom so that they could carry on their lives comfortably. There might be heavier, and there was, of course, a difference in taxation within the Mughal
And this
Empire.
presumably is one of the reasons why almost when the East India Company is just establishing itself on the very margins of Mughal India, in Surat and so on, why they have to keep making these pilgrimages to Agra to meet the Mughal, because of the differing taxations and the different tariff levels that their trade will have, and whether they can get... and what would be the comparison to that in England? If you were, for the sake of argument, a Moroccan, which is a country, a very different country, which is in contact with Elizabethan England. Would you have been allowed to set up shop in London? I mean, there were lots of, surprisingly large number of Moroccans operating in London at this time.
Yes, you would be allowed to carry on trade, and not only Moroccans, but there are actually shops by people described as so-and-so the Indian in London. If you were in the Royal Exchange, which is the first kind of shopping mall in early Stuart, 17th century London, you could walk down it and buy Victorian kind of Virginian beaver hats and to Moroccan tobacco and all kinds of things.
Indians therefore being Native Americans in our parlance, or Indians being people from this part of the world?
Well,
or both?
Probably both. And in these cases, the slipperiness of the term Indian absorbs a lot. So quite often you're not entirely sure what they mean. It operates in the same way the word Moor operates quite often.
And there's plenty of Moors. Albion Blackamoor, the rope dancer, appears in London at this time.
Yes, so Roe, even as a young man, would have been very used to seeing faces that were other among London streets, particularly in the kind of shipping kind of areas of London, on the port side.
So let's move on to Roe himself. Who is he? He's already been to the Amazon by the time he's sent off to Mughal India. So, I mean, he's a very globalized figure.
He is, but here's the thing. I mean, Roe is complicated in the sense that, you know, he comes partly his father's side is a very, very established merchant family. He's got Lord Mayors of London, you know, 3 generations of them before him. His father was the poor third son. So on the glitzier side, or his court contacts come from his mum rather than from his dad. And that's really important because Roe is an aristocrat without the money that an aristocrat would need for the kind of flashy living that Stuart court was really famous for. And that's a really interesting point of tension for him throughout his life.
That, through the entire colonial period, is one of the main drivers. It's the people coming out to India are never the dukes, the earls, and the landed super gentry.
Yeah.
It is always the squires who've got younger sons who are not haven't got the money and need to take a risk, to make a gamble.
I mean, and you know what? I had assumed till I started working on Roe's journals that that whole idea of the problematic younger son being carted off to India was an 18th century thing, but it isn't. The moment Roe gets his appointment as the English ambassador, he starts getting letters and requests from people who say to him, you know, look, could you take my nephew with you? I mean, he's very bright, a bit lively, and then he regrets saying yes to these people throughout his embassy.
And again, something to clarify. So we have an idea of Roe, we have an idea of James I. Is Roe working for James I, or is he working for the company? And is there any distinction between the two? Because in my book, I made a pitch for the company being something fairly autonomous at this period. It later becomes a public-private partnership after 1784, after it goes bankrupt and is rescued by the state. But other than having a royal charter, how much is the East India Company as independent of the British state as, say, Facebook or Google is from the American state today? Or is it really an arm of the state in all but name, in your view?
I think there's a degree to which the company was very, very wary of getting too involved in the state. It did not want to be seen as an instrument of the crown. But at the same time,
to take advantage of any contacts that the company
It's entirely happy to take advantage, and it has to, because the Mughals wouldn't give the merchants the time of the day. They were simply shopkeepers and merchants, and it was beneath the Mughal state to talk to these people in order to make any trade licenses. And the Mughals weren't the only ones. You know, the same problem. And this is the interesting thing about Anglo-Indian encounters in this period, that in a way they're repeating mistakes that they have already made elsewhere, in Russia and in the Ottoman Empire.
Muscovy Company and the Levant Company.
Exactly.
So again, just to give anyone that doesn't know this history, one of the huge innovations of this period is the Elizabethan invention of the joint stock company.
Yeah.
Previously, you have things like guilds, which you had to be a wool merchant to join, and you could then pool your resources and go off and trade in Flanders, for example, and come back. But a joint stock company means that not only is it wool merchants or whatever you're trading in, anyone can invest in it. So you can be a knight from a landed family in Yorkshire, you can be a vintner importing wine, a leather worker of very humble origins. If you've got the money, you can invest in the company, and if it makes a profit, you get a share of it.
Yeah. And not only the men, I mean, let's not forget the women. There's a wonderful little bit of advert for the Virginia Company around roughly the same time, which has different verses targeting different sections of the society. So the Virginia Company raises money for its joint stock by introducing a lottery.
Brilliant.
One of the very first lotteries, actually, kind of national lotteries. And this particular verse is directed towards the women and says, you know, if you have some spare cash, why don't you invest? And this is better than any fortunate marriage you could make, because you'll get a great return. And you can't guarantee that in a marriage.
We should also say at this point, although it's a slight dog's leg, but it is one of my favourite stories from this period, there is a proposal from the Moroccans, who are now cozying up to the Elizabethan court because they both hate the Portuguese and the Spanish, and the British and the Portuguese make an alliance against the Catholic powers. And the King of Morocco proposes that he help Queen Elizabeth colonize the New World, America. And then he says, but I think we should send our people, not you, because you're used to fogs and rains, and we're much better at the sort of climate you'd find in Florida. and it's actually considered, this proposal.
Well, yes, it is. And I mean, there are such a range of mad ideas that come up. You know, there's a term called prospecting, which is, you know, becomes a key thing that drives Stuart trade, 17th century trade, where you have every kind of entrepreneur coming up with strange ideas. One of the things poor Roe has to deal with is this man who ends up at Jahangir's court, who wants to create a waterwork pipeline for Jahangir in India. And even Roe, despite his blindness to kind of the nuances of Indian customs, realizes this is not going to work in India. A, they've already got their own waterworks, which are better and
very
prettier.
Sophisticated. All those
Exactly.
screws and. Yeah.
And B, you cannot have the same water supply for any given town because of religious differences.
Brilliant.
So yeah, entrepreneurs rule Britain in this point.
So Roe is sent off representing the crown, but with the company sort of clinging on to him and providing his transport. And so describe his arrival in Surat.
He arrives in Surat, so he leaves England in February. He has just got married, problematic marriage where he's married someone terribly against this girl's mother's wishes. He's desperate to earn some money, has great dreams. He's kitted himself out because he firmly believes that an ambassador
He's also writing letters to an old girlfriend, isn't he? The Countess of Portsmouth, or what is she called?
He does write a lot of letters to a lot of people, but I think, I mean, Eleanor Roe, who he has got married to, the problem is that they have to keep this marriage secret. And they do end up keeping that marriage secret for the whole 5 years, pretty much. Till he comes back. But yeah, so here is Roe, 34 years old, kitted himself out in fancy gold taffeta doublets and all kinds of things. He also packs a bed and a viol, which I find really interesting, you know.
A viol?
Yeah. So something to sleep on, something for music, and be smartly dressed, and you tick all the boxes.
And in his baggage, among other things, is the old Lord Mayor of London's coach.
That's right. The East India Company has to kind of mull over what they can send as a gift. And gifts are important. They know this. Other people have reported back to them. They also know it because all the other
gifts
kings
were very inadequate.
Yeah, and, you know, this is not a kind of English problem just with India. I mean, the Russian Tsar has been complaining endlessly for years about the terrible gifts that the English have sent.
Not even the
time to
Scots,
time.
just the English.
Just the English. So this time they are absolutely certain to make good on whatever they're going to promise. So they send a carriage, a very flash carriage, and we know how flash it might be because there's another which they had sent to the Russian Tsar after his complaints, which still survives at the Kremlin.
Brilliant.
So this is a velvet-covered carriage with gilt kind of decoration and all of that. And they also send a virginal, which is an early version of a keyboard musical instrument.
Sort of early harpsichord. Or
Early harpsichord.
a plucky thing.
Very fashionable in this period. Elizabeth I was herself an adept player of the virginal. So they're sending two cutting-edge things. It's like sending, sending someone the latest Tesla and iPhone. They're really proud of it. Coaches are a new invention in England. They're all thrilled to see coaches. So they send this. What they forget is that wood, gilt, velvet, and sea breeze is not a good combination. I mean, it's dreadful. By the time they unload it, pretty much everything has fallen apart or tarnished.
And this goes on. This is much later, 200 years after this. Alexander Burns tries to take a coach to Ranjit Singh in Lahore, and that too arrives as this sort of shabby mess. Which,
you have a sense that people think, this time it's going to be different.
The iPhone will work. They won't forget the charger. Yeah. So they land in Surat, and then immediately they run into bureaucratic issues.
Exactly. As any traveler knows, the first thing you have to deal with when you land in any country is immigration and baggage problems, and that's exactly what Roe faces. He lands in Surat, they say to him, we're going to search all your baggage.
And they confiscate the iPhone.
They do. They can confiscate the carriage. The carriage he's pinned all his hopes on. And not only that, Zulfikar Khan, the governor of Surat, is mean about the carriage. Apparently, behind Roe's back, he mutters to somebody else, did the English know not better than to bring a pipe and a cart as gifts? Roe is not pleased.
So he then finally gets permission to head on to Ajmer, but on the way he sees famine, which is an interesting matter because, again, there's some views that famine only began in India after the colonial period. There are many reports, aren't there, from this period. What's the Russian traveller? Nikita Afasin?
Yeah.
He also reports massive famines in this period.
Yeah.
Could you talk to that a bit?
It's interesting because Roe is such a factual observer. So he talks about bodies lining the road. He talks about the shortage of food. But also what's really interesting is the sheer contrast from region to region. So, there's about a couple of weeks when he's going through this terribly devastated area. And you can see that he is moved by that scene, essentially, of deprivation.
It's really quite interesting because already by this period, we've already established that England is a poor country, relatively speaking, and Mughal India is a very rich country in absolute terms. But already by this period, per capita income is much less clearly... already in India, you've got those extremes of wealth and poverty, which...
Exactly. I think... that's one of the things that comes across very clearly from Roe's journals. And by the way...
And his chaplain, Terry.
Yeah. And by the way, I mean, this is all, you realize, thanks to bureaucracy and paperwork. The East India Company's obsession with paperwork meant both Roe and most of the other key figures in his embassy had to keep a day-to-day journal.
That was part of their sort of contract?
Oh, yeah.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah. And not only the ambassador, ship's captains and second mates had to keep a day-to-day journal as well.
And so when we're reading this stuff now in the British Library or wherever it is, we should remember that these are public documents for everyone's consumption.
Because these are trade documents.
Right.
So they would be kept under lock and key in the middle of the city of London at Philpott Lane. at the East India Company's house. So Sir Thomas Smythe, the governor of the East India Company's house.
Just again to give an impression of sort of, you know, in a sense, industrial espionage at this period. Tell the story of Lynn Shoughton going to Goa. That's a fabulous tale, just quickly.
So this is before Roe. This is around 1580s. And this Dutch traveler called Jan van Linschoten arrives in Goa. And he acts as a secretary for the Portuguese governor of Goa. But then he goes back to his own home country and writes this book called The Description of India. It's one of the fullest...
With maps.
Yeah, with maps and wonderful illustrations. It's one of the most...
He's copied at night the maps of the Portuguese in Goa,
Yeah.
and he smuggles them back to Europe. And the British, or the English at this point, are so gripped by this that the book is translated within 18 months? From Dutch to,
particularly by a man called Richard Hakluyt, who is the great kind of collector of travel accounts in this period, who immediately spots that. But the other thing
and is present in the very first meeting of the East India Company in Mughal.
Exactly.
In Mughal.
I mean, Hakluyt is a great figure because he collects together all the writings of English travelers before this. And in fact, his collection, the principal navigations of the English nation, is so important that all East India Company ships are instructed that they must have a copy of Hakluyt on board. So you have this image of captains leafing through this huge tome to get those little details of wind and rain and monsoons and all of that.
So they pass from Surat through this devastated country with peasants dying around them and scenes of real horror, and they arrive in Ajmer. Do they get to see Jahangir immediately, or what's the...
Not immediately, because by the time they've arrived in Ajmer, Roe is already suffering.
Bloody flux.
He has literally and metaphorically the bloody flux, which is severe dysentery, essentially. And he suffers with that for the whole 5 years, off and on. People in his entourage die from the flux and from various other infections. Roe is carried in a litter, in a palki, in a palanquin, about half the way, because he simply can't sit on horseback anymore. It's too much for him. So when he comes in to Ajmer, he actually chooses to wait outside Ajmer till it's dark before he comes in, because he takes his role quite seriously. And that's the interesting thing about Roe. He's terribly grumpy, terribly stressed most of the time, but the one thing that comes through is how seriously he takes his role as a representative of his country.
And he's surprisingly, I'm always amazed again because we've established the relative power relations, he's surprisingly arrogant already.
He is.
There's no sort of sensation in his journal that he's from this backwoods country.
No.
He is impressed by Mughal India, but he's also a little bit snotty.
He is very snotty, in fact, but partly that is because he knows that is his role. So Roe he's a bit of a kind of really boring, studious diplomat in that sense. So before he comes, he reads through all the handbooks of diplomacy. And they tell him that the diplomat, the ambassador, is meant to be a reflection of the monarch. So you are standing in for your monarch. Roe has this huge sense of responsibility. And remember what I said about being part merchant, part aristocracy. He wants to opt for that latter. So he wants to opt for that association rather than the East India Company Association in terms of his role. So that pride, that haughtiness that he displays is very much kind of founded on his sense that he is representing James I. And before he came, James I wrote a letter to him saying, now look, whatever you do, trade license, yes, but the other thing is you must impress on the Mughal emperor, who I know is one of the greatest emperors in the world, that I am pretty impressive myself. And I have plenty of people who fear my name.
And one of the sort of comic things reading his journals is that wherever he goes, his accommodation is not what he hopes for. He's always put in the kind of youth hostel rather than the clerk's mare.
Gosh, he is, and then he's also saddled with these other people in his group. You know, anyone who's traveled in any kind of small group, you'll know, there's always one, isn't there? The person with the most baggage. Who will take up the free seat and put their bag and spread all their stuff around so that no one else can move around, and he has one of them.
And also, he can't ever fit his presence into wherever he's staying, is it? There's
No,
a terrible worry that...
He's always worried about the presence, he's always worried about the goods, and that's the other thing.
With good reason, because robbery is a big deal at this time.
It is, and he is carrying trading stuff with him. You know, he is partly funded by the East India Company. He has the merchants of the East India Company carrying goods with them. So it's a weird combination of a business trip and a diplomatic trip, and Roe is caught in the middle.
I love it. So how quickly, when does he eventually get to meet Jahangir?
Well, Jahangir waits patiently for 2 days, and then he sends a messenger who bursts into Roe's room while he's probably moaning and groaning, clutching his middle, and demands when he's going to pay court. So Roe thinks, you know, he'd better pull his act together. And 3 days later, he's there, walking through the great gates of Ajmer, trying not to feel intimidated.
We're in Jaipur now. Ajmer is an hour away. How, if anyone here wanted to go and see, for example, there's lovely pavilions on the lake in Ajmer. Was that something Roe would have seen, and was that still a bit later?
Well, that's later.
Yeah.
But Ajmer has already become a major center, you know, thanks to Akbar and Akbar's interest in the Sufi religion, for instance.
So the Dargah.
Because of the Dargah, because of Akbar's own very famous pilgrimage, hoping for a son, Ajmer was already the center, in some ways, of Mughal culture, the Mughal imaginative landscape.
So the gateway of the
gateway
Dargah,
was there.
Something he would have seen.
So Roe talks about walking through that gateway, being greeted at the first gate, being taken down through the street, through the main thoroughfare, which is still there, and being taken to the Darbar, the open Darbar.
And is Jahangir partly there because, in a sense, this is where he was sort of at least spiritually conceived? That it was the Chishti order that brought him into being. Akbar does the pilgrimage on foot.
You get the sense even from the Jahangirnama, which again forms a major informing part of my book, that Jahangir feels very much at home in Ajmer. And he is there for great periods of time. Partly because he likes traveling and he takes any excuse to go away from the center. But Ajmer has that sense of familiarity for him in more ways than one, I think, both spiritually and in terms of his kind of social and political network. So he's there, and Roe is taken in, brought up to the Lalbari, the red boundary before the inner court.
Which is like the final gate before you actually are admitted to the presence.
Yeah, and then he has a spat with the court officials about whether he's going to take his hat off and whether he's going to do a Kurnish or not.
a prostration.
Yeah. And he says no, because diplomatic custom demands that he should use his own country's form of obedience, a kind of respect, showing of respect.
Which would be a sort of a bow and take your hat off.
Very florid bow. And he had, to be fair to him, he had invested a great deal of money, we know exactly how much money, in a very fancy hat. He wanted to show it off.
So he's finally admitted.
He is finally admitted. The fancy hat comes into action. He makes his very florid bow to Jahangir. Jahangir apparently looks at him with every sign of pleasure and respect and welcomes him.
This is his account, though.
This is his account. And that's something to always remember, that Roe is writing in his journal for the East India Company and for James I.
And again, to get a bit of background, Akbar had talked about Northern Europeans as almost sort of savages, hadn't he? So,
yes.
So even getting to this stage is a bit of an achievement for...
it is. There's a wonderful kind of report of Akbar's saying to his courtiers that these people who have come from the north, essentially, these Firangis who have come, it is our duty to show them what true court culture is like. So Roe, and that's one of the really interesting things about Roe's embassy, particularly because he's so familiar with this other part of English encounters in Northern America. He's an investor in the Virginia Company as well as the East India Company. So there is a real shift here. Whereas within the North American scenario, the English could talk about essentially blank slates. So the English defense there was terra nullius. If you have land that you think is not being appropriately cultivated, it's your Christian duty to cultivate it in the right way. And therefore you can take over anyone's land. But Ajmer is not terra nullius. It is crowded, it is civilized, there are huge houses, there are shops and people of every culture there already. In Mughal miniatures, you can spot Jesuit priests and Portuguese people with nifty pearl earrings and all kinds of people.
Any uneasy encounters with Jesuits on this? Because obviously the Jesuits are the enemy. They're treated like sort of KGB agents by the English wherever they go. Are they around in Ajmer at this time?
They are. Thanks to Roe's own resistance to learning any of the Mughal court languages.
I thought he had Persian.
He didn't. He resisted
Turkish?
it all the way through. Nothing.
Nothing.
So he had to depend on an Italian jeweler to whom he spoke in broken Spanish, and then later on the Jesuit priest at court to translate for him, which caused him no end of trouble. But he still wouldn't learn Persian.
Was the Jesuit sort of deliberately insulting Jahangir to get him in trouble? Or no?
Well, Roe thought that the Jesuit wasn't putting his words strongly enough. He probably should have thanked the Jesuit priest for that.
What nationality was the Jesuit priest?
Italian.
So not quite Portuguese or Spanish, not the ultimate enemy, but just sort of mildly hostile.
Exactly.
So the presents are presented, and Jahangir's quite impressed with the picture.
He is. I mean, Jahangir...
Is it his wife? No, who's the miniature?
Well, the miniature comes later. The first presents presents that are given are the swords. He's given swords, belts, carriage, and the harpsichord. Jahangir isn't particularly interested in the harpsichord, the virginal rather. The carriage, he thinks, okay, I can work with this.
But he orders a new trim.
He orders pretty much new everything. So he takes the model, and the next time Roe sees the carriage come out, it has been completely reupholstered.
It's been given a sort of Brigitte Singh or a sort of nice Inoki interior.
It's been given Indian velvet and cloth of gold treatment. All the nails had been taken out and replaced with gold and silver nails.
Brilliant.
And to annoy Roe even more, Jahangir had employed the coachman and taken him into his own service, and now the coachman was earning more probably than Roe's own weekly wages.
And so let's talk about the miniature, because this is in Mandu, or is it here that the miniature?
This is in slightly later in Mandu. Yeah. There's a moment where Roe is invited for one of Jahangir's evening kind of darbars. And Roe knows that Jahangir is interested in art, and he very quickly realizes that really he cannot compete with the Ranas of Rajasthan, for instance, in terms of tribute. The same day when he presents his tribute, he talks about these men who come from the deserts in the north, who have presented huge platters of gold and silver to the Mughal emperor. So he can't compete with that. He is really clever about saying, okay, I'm going to present things that are unique, and that means, in this case, English miniatures. The thing that the English are really good at are beautiful, tiny little portraits, which are both personal. Hilliard and all those other people. And these are both intimate and personal. And Roe had carried a few with him. Some of them are of his king, but there's one particular one which may have been of a woman he had fallen in love with a long time ago, when he was a young man in his 20s.
And he doesn't want to part with it.
He does not. He says to Jahangir that this is a woman I had loved and is no more. But Jahangir says, look, okay, but this is beautiful. Tell you what, I'm going to take this from you and ask one of my court artists to make 5 copies if you can recognize your own copy, you can have it back.
It's brilliant.
It's wonderful. It's the kind of center point of Roe's embassy, this particular wager. And
So
there are
what
multiple
happens?
ways. So Roe goes back in a week's time, and there are 5 copies in the kind of candlelight. And Roe is very careful to mention that in the glittering candlelight, he failed to recognize his own original.
Brilliant.
And then there's a long kind of debate about what prize he could give the artist. He says, oh, shall I give him money? And Jahangir says, no, but this is one of the khanzadas of our court. You can't just give him some money. Give him something that you really appreciate. So he gives him a collection of paintings from England.
Which is why then you see pictures of James I turning up in Mughal miniatures over the
Exactly.
next...
Yeah.
And then they talk about beer.
They do. Jahangir is really interested in it. This is the point where Jahangir is...
Jahangir, we should say, for those who don't know, is interested in alcohol in general.
He is deeply interested in alcohol in general. He is also very, very clear-sighted that he needs to cut down. So there's a wonderful bit in the Jahangirnama.
I know this feeling well, particularly during Jaipur.
His physician, his court physician, basically says to him, look, I can't keep you alive if you're not going to help yourself. So he needs to cut down. So you kind of get a sense that he's kind of enjoying alcohol through proxy here. So he asks Roe about beer, how it's brewed, how it's
Who
drunk.
brings up beer? Is Jahangir asked the question, or does
Jahangir asks the question. So he asks him, he gives him some arak, and Roe splutters over it.
Triple distilled.
Exactly. Roe says he nearly kind of kills himself. Remember, this is a man with a bloody flux for the last 6 months.
I might sort him out.
So he splutters over it, which amuses Jahangir, and then Jahangir asks him, what do you drink? And he says, well, we usually drink beer, and then goes on to this kind of ode about beer, essentially.
And how does he describe beer? Made from wheat? I mean, it's that kind of level of...
It is. I mean, he doesn't go into the details in his journal, but this is a conversation that takes about a couple of hours. So he goes into, we suspect, into a fair degree of detail about beer making with the Mughal emperor.
So he's in Ajmer. He then follows Jahangir down to my favorite place in the whole of India, I think probably Mandu. Describe the scene there.
When Jahangir sets off from Ajmer, he asks Roe whether he's going to follow him. And Roe says to him, where you go, I shall go. I shall follow you to the ends of the world, which, he says, before knowing about the route to Mandu. And then has a
Even
terrible
today, the roads
time.
in Madhya Pradesh are not all they could be. Yeah.
He has an absolutely terrible time. I mean, you really feel for the poor man. First, there's the problem with transport because, of course, all of Jahangir's courtiers exactly know the deal. They've all booked up the transport way before him. So the poor Persian emperor's ambassador and Roe bond over the fact that there are, as they say, 5 flea-ridden camels left in Ajmer at this point to transport all of them.
But when they arrive, Roe is put in some sort of pavilion up on the hilltop.
He bag-sees that pavilion.
Yeah.
By this point, he's learned his lesson about terrible accommodation choices. So he's very proud that once he gets to Mandu, he kind of makes a beeline for a pavilion. What he doesn't realize is that it's the furthest one from the drinking well, which is not a good thing in
And there are
Mandu.
tigers.
And there are tigers. It's right on the border. He's really pleased at first that it's away from the hubbub of the rest of the court. But of course, it's right on the border of the woodlands. So one of the sacrifices is his pet dog, who's taken by a lion.
We're nearly out of time, and I'm sure people will want to try to question. So just quickly, so let's fast forward just to the end of the story. Roe gets back in one piece, despite the bloody flux, but doesn't really get the trading deal that he's hoping for.
No, I mean, Roe's main aim was to get an exclusive trade deal. In other words, boot the Portuguese out.
It's Brexit all over again.
And that doesn't happen. Khurram, the later Shah Jahan particularly, is very, very keen on ensuring that he has 2 European powers to play against each other. He does not want a single European power to be the only European source of trade in India.
And then later, when Roe is back in England, he writes some interesting letters.
That's right.
Because again, the British economy, the English economy is in crisis.
The English economy had been in crisis right from James I's reign on to, this is the point where Charles I is on the throne, and is really worried about how to raise money. And this is the point of friction between Charles and his parliament, which will later become the Civil War in England. But in 1640...
In which the East India Company will back firmly Parliament.
Exactly. But at this point, in 1640, at Roe's very last parliamentary speech, and it's a magnificent speech, he's been called in as a very experienced trade advisor and ambassador to talk about how to circumvent this economic crisis. And he says to Charles I, to his monarch, that the best advice I can give you is to emulate the Mughal emperor, who is one of the greatest emperors of the world, and allow people of other faiths and religions to settle in England, to conduct their business, and to live as they please. Because that is what establishes a true stable economy.
So can we say that maybe one of the reasons why the English economy improves subsequently, and you do become London does genuinely, to everyone's surprise, become the marketplace of Europe, is because they follow the Indian Mughal model?
Perhaps to some extent, although at that point they thoroughly ignore Roe.
Right.
And that's one of the interesting things, that Roe's embassy is a road not taken. And the really firm point that Roe makes throughout his journal is that the thing not to do in India is to establish a colony. He says that's the worst decision you could take. It's a money drain. You should not do it.
And he's looking at the amount of money the Portuguese are spending on fortresses and how the Estado is losing a lot of money.
Yeah. So he says what we need is a quick, agile enterprise, and it has to be a trading
and a peaceful
enterprise.
Trade.
Exactly.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, Nandini Das. We have time for maybe 2 quick questions. This gentleman in the front with the stylish cravat. There's a...
I think probably it's best to say the question addressed to you, both of you. See, we have been programmed over the last so many years, coming to the Jaipur Lit Fest, and William, you have been the master in that, providing us with a deep insight into the East India Company. And the question now arises, as far as I'm concerned, is the preceding history. That was there were the Dutch people, the Dutch East India Company, and preceding them were the Portuguese. But that's besides the point, really, at this point. The thing which interests me now is the role of Mr. Roe as representative of the Crown, or was he really in the service of the East India Company? And who were his paymasters? And for whom was he working when he arrived at Jahangir's court? I would love to hear that.
So Roe is jointly appointed by the East India Company and the state. The state appoints him as an ambassador, but he's bankrolled by the East India Company because the Stuart state, James I's government, has no money to fund an embassy. This is not unusual in this period. Quite often the trading companies would say, we need someone worthy to go out and speak for us, so we will provide the money, but you appoint someone who is appropriately noble and cultured and honorable enough, essentially. And that's partly the problem with, as far as Roe is concerned. He's torn between these two paths.
We have time for one very quick last question.
I'm afraid we're completely
We don't have time for one last question.
As much as we would love to continue this vital conversation, thank you so much, Nandini Das and William Dalrymple, for this.
There